The Empire was a sprawling colossus, a patchwork of worlds bound by the fragile threads of allegiance and fear. Emperor Alaric Kane had risen to power with a vision, a unified human race that would spread across the stars, unstoppable in its ambition. But now, the very vision that had inspired millions was slipping through his fingers. The human empire, once a proud monolith of order and prosperity, had splintered into warring factions, each one fighting for control of key systems. The outer colonies, rich with resources but too far from the central authority, were the first to rebel. Now the core systems, those that had been the heart of the empire's power, were teetering on the edge of civil war. Alaric paced the ornate halls of his palace on Coruscant, staring out over the capital's gleaming skyline. Below, the city was alive with activity. Hovercars darted between towering skyscrapers, transport vessels carried passengers to and fro, and soldiers marched through the streets, their boots echoing off the marble floors. But none of it reassured him. Coruscant was a city of lies, its splendor hiding the decay beneath the surface. "We've lost another sector," came a voice from behind him. It was Admiral Kalen, his most trusted general, and the one man Alaric relied upon to maintain order within the military. Kalen's sharp features were hard as stone, but there was a glimmer of unease in his eyes. "The rebels in the Trappist sector have overrun our defenses. They're calling for secession. It's only a matter of time before the outer rim falls into complete chaos." Alaric turned to face him, his brow furrowed. "And the others, the loyalists?" Kalen shook his head. "We've had pockets of resistance, but nothing substantial. The warlords are picking their sides. Each of them has their own plans, their own ambitions. They're using this instability as an opportunity to carve out their own empires." Alaric's gaze hardened. "This empire doesn't belong to them," he muttered. His hand tightened around the railing. "It belongs to humanity, to me." Kalen hesitated, his voice lowering. "Your Majesty, you must understand. The situation is dire. If you do not act quickly—" "I will act," Alaric interrupted sharply. "And I will do whatever it takes to restore order. But first, we must uncover the source of this unrest." His eyes narrowed, a dangerous gleam flickering in his expression. "Someone is behind this, someone who is orchestrating these rebellions." He moved toward the communications terminal in the corner of the room, his fingers already typing in commands. "Alert all high-ranking officials to report to the war room. We are going to root out the traitors." Kalen stiffened. "My lord, are you sure that's wise? If you move too fast—" "I will move at the speed of light if it saves the Empire," Alaric shot back. "Every one of these rebels is a threat to humanity's future. I will not let them succeed." As the room's holographic displays flickered to life, Alaric's thoughts turned inward. He'd always trusted his generals, his advisors. He had to. But something wasn't right. In the chaos of the war, he could sense the growing whispers in the shadows, the treachery that lay beneath the surface. His enemies were everywhere. Suddenly, a loud alert interrupted his thoughts. A transmission from the border systems, a desperate plea for help. "Emperor Kane." The voice on the transmission crackled. "They're here. They've breached the outer defenses. The Axalan fleet. They've returned." Alaric's blood ran cold. The Axalan, a ruthless alien species humanity had fought decades to contain, had not been heard from in years, until now. He turned sharply to Kalen. "Prepare the fleet. We may have bigger problems than civil war." The gravity of the situation hit Alaric like a hammer. The Talon fleet had been the scourge of humanity's early expansion into the galaxy. For years, the Empire had fought a brutal, unrelenting war against them, pushing them back into the fringe sectors. No one had expected them to return. Especially not now, when the Empire was already on the brink of collapse. "Admiral, I want a full mobilization," Alaric ordered, his voice hard with command. "Tell General Vance to take the First Fleet and intercept them. I want them engaged at the edge of the system, before they can set up a blockade." Kalen nodded, his expression grim. At once, my emperor. But as the admiral turned to leave, a sudden pang of doubt tugged at Alaric's mind. The timing was too convenient. The Talon fleet had no reason to resurface now, not when humanity's enemies were already fracturing their empire. Alaric's thoughts raced. The rebellion in the Outer Rim was spreading. The warlords were in open revolt. And now, the Talon had returned without warning. Someone close to him, was pulling the strings. Before Alaric could voice his suspicions, a voice cut through the silence of the war room. It was sharp, clipped, and unmistakable. "Your Majesty, we need to talk." The figure who stepped into the room was none other than Captain Lyra Solis, the head of the Imperial Intelligence Division. Lyra had been with him since the earliest days of his reign. A brilliant strategist, she was loyal, efficient, and ruthless when it came to protecting the Empire. But now, the haunted look in her eyes gave Alaric pause. "What is it, Captain?" he asked, his voice quiet but demanding. She moved swiftly across the room, her steps purposeful. "We've intercepted communications," she began, lowering her voice as if to guard the secret she was about to share. "There's been a series of encrypted messages between the rebellion and high-ranking Imperial officials." Alaric's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? Who is involved?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, then activated a holographic display. The image that appeared shocked Alaric to his core. On the screen was a list of names, his closest advisors, the ones who had been with him through every crisis, every victory, every loss. There were generals, senators, and most disturbing of all, Admiral Kalen's name was at the top of the list. "He's been communicating with the rebels." Alaric's voice was cold with disbelief. Lyra nodded grimly. "Not only that, but we've traced some of the encrypted messages back to sources within the Xalan fleet. They're planning a full-scale attack, but it's not just about conquest. It's about disrupting your leadership, discrediting your reign from within." Alaric's mind raced. Kalen, his most trusted general, a traitor. It was almost too much to believe, but the evidence was undeniable. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. If Kalen was involved, it meant that someone had been working against him for a long time, carefully orchestrating the rebellion, and now even the alien invasion. "We can't waste time," Alaric said, his voice hard with resolve. "Lyra, I need you to gather all the evidence we have. We can't let this go any further." Lyra's eyes darkened. "We're already too late, Your Majesty. The betrayal runs deeper than we feared. Kalen is the head of a faction within your military, an insurgent faction that's been working in the shadows for months. He's planning to take control of the Imperial fleet. He won't just destroy you, Emperor. He plans to destroy everything you've built." Alaric's pulse quickened. Betrayal, the rebellion, the Xalan invasion, the fractured empire. It was all connected. But how? Who else could be involved in this web of treachery? Before he could ask, the palace's comm system hummed to life once again. A high-priority transmission blinked on his console, urgent and direct. "Your Majesty," came a voice from the other end. "It's Kalen. He requests an immediate audience. He says he has information about the Xalan fleet." Alaric's mind churned with suspicion. The Admiral's timing was too perfect. If he was indeed behind this, offering information now was a calculated move, one designed to manipulate Alaric, to pull him into the next phase of his scheme. Alaric turned to Lyra, his voice low but sharp. "Get me everything you can on Kalen. I want eyes on him at all times. He won't get another chance to deceive me." With the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together, Alaric realized something far more dangerous than rebellion lurked on the horizon. His most trusted general, his closest ally, was about to make his move, and Alaric knew he couldn't let it happen. Not now. Not ever. Alaric's mind burned with the weight of his discovery. Admiral Kalen, the man who had led humanity's forces for years, was a traitor. The Taxalan fleet's sudden return was no coincidence. It was part of a far-reaching plan, one designed to tear down everything Alaric had worked for. As the scheming web began to unravel, Alaric knew the time had come to make an impossible decision. He needed a weapon, something far beyond the ordinary forces of his empire. Something that could give humanity an edge against the insurgency threatening from within and without. The answer, though buried under layers of secrecy and moral ambiguity, was the Nova Legion, a program initiated at the dawn of Alaric's reign, designed to push human potential beyond its natural limits. With the galaxy spiraling into chaos, he had no choice but to activate it. There were risks, of course, unimaginable risks, but Alaric was past the point of hesitation. His empire, his vision for humanity, demanded bold action. In the deepest recesses of the Imperial Science Directorate, Alaric stood before the lab's reinforced doors, a dark promise in his mind. The program's creators, a cadre of geneticists and cybernetic engineers, had always been quiet about the specifics. They had warned him of the dangers, of the potential consequences of tampering too deeply with humanity's genetic code. But Alaric had insisted that they press forward. Now, the time had come to unlock the terrifying fruits of their labor. The doors opened, and the sterile, dimly lit laboratory revealed rows upon rows of cryo-chambers, each one containing the result of the Nova Legion. Humans transformed beyond recognition. The bodies inside were muscular, their skin augmented with bio-armor that shimmered faintly under the cold lighting. Enhanced neural interfaces ran beneath the surface of their skin, connecting their minds directly to the weapons they would wield. Alaric could almost feel the power thrumming through the air, a palpable force that made his skin crawl. These were not soldiers, they were weapons, born from the cutting edge of human ingenuity and genetic manipulation. Your Majesty, Dr. Ilara, the lead scientist, stepped forward with a hesitant bow. Her face was a mask of cold efficiency, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. The Legion is ready for deployment. The genetic enhancements have been fully integrated, and their neural pathways are now linked directly to their combat systems. But I must remind you, Emperor, that these soldiers are different. They do not possess the same ethical constraints as ordinary soldiers. I'm well aware of that, Doctor, Alaric replied. His gaze was fixed on the cryo chamber before him. Inside, the figure of one soldier stood out, a woman, tall and imposing, her features hardened by years of training and genetic enhancement. Her eyes, however, remained hauntingly human. She is the first of the Legion, Dr. Ilara continued, sensing his focus. Her name is Vera-1. She was the first to be reborn. She has shown remarkable loyalty to the program, but her behavior... Alaric interrupted, stepping closer to the chamber. She's a weapon, Doctor. You don't need to worry about loyalty. What matters is whether she can fight. Dr. Ilara's lips tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she activated the cryo chamber. The soldier's eyes snapped open instantly, her pupils dilating as she took in her surroundings. There was no confusion in her gaze, only cold calculation, as if she had been awake all along, waiting for this moment. Vera-1 stepped out of the chamber, towering over both Alaric and Dr. Ilara. Her body, an intricate web of synthetic muscle and organic tissue, flexed with barely restrained power. As her gaze met Alaric's, he saw no fear, no hesitation. She was ready. I am ready, Emperor, she said, her voice calm but tinged with a deadly edge. The words were not just a declaration. They were a statement of fact. She had been made for this moment. Alaric studied her for a long moment, feeling a rush of grim satisfaction. The Nova Legion was born. Humanity's greatest weapon was now in his hands. He turned to Dr. Ilara, his voice a low growl. Deploy the Legion. We don't have time to waste. The doctor nodded, and with a swift motion, she activated a hidden command. All across the laboratory, the other chambers began to open. One by one, the Nova Legion emerged, each soldier more imposing than the last. Alaric watched them move, fluid, efficient, and utterly lethal. But as he gazed upon the soldiers, a question gnawed at him, one he couldn't shake. Would they remain loyal to him, or would they, like so many before them, become tools of those who sought to use them for their own ends? In that moment, he realized that unleashing the Nova Legion might not just change the course of the war. It might change the very nature of what it meant to be human. With the Nova Legion now unleashed, the next stage of Alaric's Gambit had begun. The galaxy would never be the same again. The Nova Legion stood ready, a silent, terrifying force at Alaric's command. The battle for Mars, the Empire's most fortified and strategic colony, was upon them. The Talon fleet had breached the Outer Rim, but it was Mars that would serve as the first battleground in the war for humanity's future. The rebellion had gained a foothold in the colony, using its terrain and resources to rally support. But the stakes had risen. Alaric knew that whoever controlled Mars controlled the path to victory. The Talon, once a distant threat, were now working in tandem with Kaelin's rogue faction within the Empire, their forces converging on the colony. Mars had become a pressure point where the rebellion, the rogue Imperial forces, and the Talon's cold ambition would all clash. If the Nova Legion could retake Mars, the rebellion would lose a vital support base, and the Talon would be forced into retreat. But if they failed, the war would escalate, and Alaric would lose the final chance to save the Empire. As the Nova Legion descended upon Mars, their transports thundered across the red sky. Each soldier's neural interface had been activated, sensing them with the advanced weaponry designed for one purpose: to annihilate any threat without hesitation. Alaric watched from the command center on Coruscant, the live feed showing the Legion landing in Mars' capital city, Olympus Mons. The sound of the transport's engines echoed in his mind as the soldiers disembarked, their boots hitting the ground with mechanical precision. Vera 1 led the charge, her heavy boots cutting through the Martian dust with ease. Her squad, a group of lethal warriors enhanced to near perfection, spread out behind her, each moving like a unit of death. The rebellion had set up barricades, but they were no match for the Nova Legion. In mere moments, Vera 1's squad tore through them, their advanced armor deflecting the rebels' fire with ease. Each soldier was a machine of war, each movement executed with flawless efficiency. The rebels stood no chance against the overwhelming might of the Legion. But as the Legion moved deeper into the city, something unsettling began to stir within Alaric's mind. He watched the soldiers execute their orders with brutal precision. Nothing was spared, not even civilians caught in the crossfire. The Nova Legion was unstoppable, but their methods were starting to disturb him. They weren't just soldiers, they were instruments of destruction, bent only on annihilation. He turned to Lyra, who had been silently observing the situation at his side. "What's the status of the rebellion's leadership?" Alaric asked, his voice tight with a mix of authority and unease. Lyra's eyes flicked to the screen, where chaos unfolded in real time. "We've identified the rebel leader on the ground. It's Commander Eric Dallin, a former officer in the Imperial fleet. He defected after you took control of the Empire, disillusioned with your rule. He's rallying the colonies under a banner of resistance." Alaric clenched his fists. Dallin had once been one of his own. The betrayal cut deeper than most. "I want him alive," he commanded, his voice cold. "We need him to understand the consequences of defying the Empire." But the chaos unfolding on Mars made it increasingly clear that the Nova Legion was no longer simply following orders. Their approach was becoming increasingly reckless. The rebels, desperate and cornered, had begun to use civilian hostages to slow the Legion's advance. Vera 1's squad, without hesitation, neutralized the threat by decimating a nearby building, killing dozens of civilians in the process. Alaric's heart sank. This was exactly what he feared. The Nova Legion was too efficient, too ruthless, and too disconnected from the humanity they were supposed to protect. The fine line between soldier and executioner had already been crossed. "Do we have confirmation on Dallin's location?" Alaric asked sharply, his voice rising with frustration. Lyra checked her data stream. Yes, he's holed up in the Capitol building, surrounded by his remaining forces. We have an opportunity to capture him. But if we wait too long, he may flee into the underground tunnels. Alaric's mind raced. He needed Dallin, but he also needed to maintain control of the Nova Legion. The longer this battle raged, the more dangerous they became, not just to the rebellion, but to everyone. A chilling thought struck him. Could the Nova Legion be his savior or his downfall? Would he lose control of them, as he had of so many before? The answer was clear. The Legion had to be stopped, not just for the sake of Mars, but for the future of the Empire. Vera 1, Alaric said, activating a direct line to the leader of the Nova Legion. Disengage from the city. I want you and your squad to target the rebel leader's position. Don't destroy the capital. Bring Dallin to me alive. Vera 1's voice came through the comm system, calm as ever. Understood, Emperor. But as the orders were given, a new fear crept into Alaric's mind. The Nova Legion was becoming more than a weapon. They were a force of their own. Could he keep them in check, or had he created a monster that would eventually turn on its creator? With the fate of Mars, and perhaps the entire Empire, hanging in the balance, Alaric's gamble was far from over. As the Nova Legion descended upon the Capitol building, the chaos in the streets of Olympus Mons seemed to settle into a grim silence. The rebellion had put up a desperate fight, but with the Legion now sweeping through their lines, the hope of victory was fading fast. Rebel forces were in full retreat, and the civilian casualties mounted with every passing minute. Alaric could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. The thought that the very thing he had built to save humanity might now be the catalyst for its destruction. Inside the Capitol building, Commander Eric Dallin stood resolute, watching as his forces were pushed back. His face was tight with the strain of leadership, and his thoughts churned with the knowledge that his rebellion was nearing its end. There was no escaping the Legion now. Their superior firepower and relentless tactics had torn through the rebel defenses. He knew his only hope lay in one last stand, and in his ability to escape. If he could make it into the underground tunnels beneath the Capitol, he might still have a chance to rally his forces and strike back. But Dallin was no fool. He could already hear the heavy footsteps of the Nova Legion soldiers as they stormed through the building. Vera 1 was leading the charge, and though her methods were brutal, there was a calculated precision to every move she made. His heart pounded as he turned to his closest officers. Get to the lower levels. I'll hold them off, Dallin barked, his voice low but steady. His officers hesitated, but the grim determination in his eyes left no room for argument. One by one, they nodded and moved to evacuate, leaving Dallin alone at the command console. With a final glance at the looming blast doors, he activated the building's defense systems, sealing off the upper levels and buying himself some time. Outside, Vera 1 and her squad approached the last line of rebel defense, their movements synchronized like a dance of death. They encountered a handful of soldiers guarding the inner sanctum, but the resistance crumbled instantly. Vera 1's enhanced reflexes made her a blur of motion, her weapons cutting through the rebels with surgical precision. The squad moved like a single organism, each member executing their part flawlessly, while Dallin's last stand came into focus on their sensors. Commander Dallin is in the command center, Vera 1 said flatly, her voice carrying an unsettling calm. We'll take him alive. She gave the signal to move forward, but just as her squad neared the inner sanctum, a massive explosion rocked the building, sending shockwaves through the structure. The walls trembled and alarms blared. The rebels had set off an explosive charge, severing the route to Dallin's position and creating chaos in the building's upper levels. Vera 1's eyes narrowed, her mind processing the situation in real time. The explosion had taken out a section of the building, but it also triggered the defense system's lockdown protocol. The blast doors had sealed them off from the command center. Dallin was now isolated. Recalculate the breach route, Vera 1 ordered, her voice unwavering. She had no tolerance for setbacks. Her squad worked quickly, moving to the alternate access points, but there was something in the back of her mind, an unsettling thought. This wasn't just about taking down a rebel leader anymore. The way Dallin had reacted, the explosives and the lockdowns, it was clear he had planned for this. He had anticipated their every move. On Coruscant, Alaric sat tensely, watching the feed from Mars, his fingers tapping the surface of his desk. The battle for the capital was dragging on longer than expected, and his frustration grew with every passing minute. The Nova Legion was designed for efficiency, but now it was becoming clear that something was off. Their cold, merciless tactics were working, but at what cost? As the scenes of carnage unfolded, the reality that this was the future he had created began to settle into his gut. How far could he let this go? How much destruction would be necessary to secure his reign? Alaric's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden alert from Lyra. "Emperor," she said urgently, "the rebellion is orchestrating something. We intercepted a transmission. Dallin has triggered a secondary strike. The capital's defense grid is powering up." Alaric's heart skipped a beat. A secondary strike. He understood immediately. Dallin was playing for time, not just to escape, but to sabotage the infrastructure of the capital itself. "We cannot allow that to happen," Alaric said, his voice cold with resolve. "Deploy the fleet to Mars orbit. I want all long-range bombardment ready to neutralize the capital if necessary." Lyra hesitated. "My Emperor, if you do that, the civilians." "There are no civilians left," Alaric cut in sharply. "If we don't act now, we lose Mars and everything with it. The rebellion is already a lost cause. We can't afford to let Dallin's escape jeopardize the Empire's control." The orders were given, and the Imperial fleet prepared for action. But Alaric couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a fine line. The Legion, the rebellion, the fleet, everything was moving in unpredictable ways, and with Kaelin's betrayal still lurking in the shadows, Alaric wondered if the very empire he sought to rebuild might soon crumble under the weight of his own decisions. The tides of war had shifted, and the true cost of Alaric's Gambit was yet to be fully realized. As the bombardment orders were transmitted to the Imperial fleet, Alaric's mind was not on Mars. His thoughts were consumed by something far darker. The battle for control was no longer about defeating external enemies. It was about holding onto power in a galaxy that seemed to unravel with each passing moment. The more he pressed the Nova Legion into action, the more he realized how fragile his own grip on humanity's future had become. Mars burned beneath the heavy fire of orbital bombardment. Explosions cascaded through Olympus Mons, shaking the ground with the force of 1,000 blows. The Capitol building, now reduced to a crumbling monument of rebellion and war, was the heart of Dallin's final resistance. Alaric watched from the command center as the destruction unfolded on screen. It was ruthless, efficient, and final. Yet, a pang of regret tugged at his chest. He had been forced to make this choice to save the Empire, but at what cost? The Nova Legion had completed their mission, capturing Dallin, who was dragged out of the wreckage, battered but alive. Vera One's squad surrounded him, their faces unreadable as they marched him to Alaric's awaiting transport ship. This, Alaric knew, would be his moment of triumph. He had crushed the rebellion, quelled Dallin's threat, and secured Mars. But even as the prisoners were loaded aboard the ship, the cracks in Alaric's empire were widening. Word had spread, quickly and quietly, about the brutality of the Legion's methods. The civilian casualties, the destruction of civilian infrastructure on Mars, these were the visible consequences of his gambit. And soon, whispers began to surface across the galaxy, not just among the Empire's enemies, but within his own ranks. Allegiances were shifting. Back on Coruscant, Lyra's face was etched with concern as she approached Alaric's command center. The ship carrying Dallin and the remaining rebel forces was still en route to Coruscant, but something in the air had changed. The loyalty of the military was no longer certain. The Nova Legion had achieved victory, but the price had been steep. And with Kalen's betrayal still looming like a dark cloud, Alaric couldn't ignore the danger of what he created. "Your Majesty," Lyra began, her voice low, "there's been an uprising. It's small for now, but it's spreading fast." Alaric's brow furrowed, his thoughts turning sharp. "Where?" "Outer Rim sectors. Several key military stations have reported discontent within their ranks. There are murmurs of rebellion, whispers about the Legion's actions. The generals are becoming increasingly uneasy." Alaric's grip tightened on the arm of his chair. He had always expected opposition from external threats. But this was different. This wasn't a battle against Salon invaders or rebel forces. This was an insurrection from within, sparked by his own decisions. His creation, the Nova Legion, was now the catalyst for his downfall. It had been designed to secure his reign. But instead, it was breaking down the very foundation of his power. "What are they saying about Kalen?" Alaric asked, his voice steady despite the growing panic in his chest. Lyra hesitated before answering. "It's hard to say, Your Majesty. We haven't caught any concrete evidence of his involvement in this uprising, but his disappearance, after the mission on Mars, has raised suspicion." Alaric felt the ground shift beneath him. Kalen was not just a traitor. He was now the symbol of everything that was wrong with Alaric's empire. His disappearance spoke volumes. It meant that Kalen was no longer merely the betrayer. He was the spark that could ignite a full-scale rebellion. He had been planning this all along. "Find him," Alaric commanded, his tone now laced with cold fury. "I want him alive. He'll answer for everything." Lyra nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "It will be done, Your Majesty." As she left to carry out the orders, Alaric's mind raced. The Nova Legion had won Mars, but at what cost? The rebellion may have been crushed for now, but the seeds of insurrection had been planted in the hearts of his own people. And with Kalen at large, those seeds could grow into something far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. The sound of footsteps echoed down the long corridor, and Alaric's gaze snapped toward the entrance to his command center. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the light. It was Vera One, her expression unreadable as she approached. "Emperor," she began, her voice as cold as always. "The rebel leader, Dallin, has been secured. We've ensured no further resistance." Alaric nodded, his thoughts elsewhere. He had the victory he sought, but the questions remained. Could he hold on to it? And at what cost would this hollow triumph be achieved? "Good," Alaric said, trying to shake the unease that gripped him. "But we need to move quickly. The rebellion is just beginning, and the Nova Legion needs to be ready." Vera One remained still, her eyes locking onto his. "The Legion is ready, Your Majesty. But I must ask, what do we do with those who no longer believe in you?" Alaric's eyes flicked to her. It was an unsettling question, one he had been avoiding for too long. His mind flashed to the growing discontent in the Empire. His command was crumbling beneath the weight of his own decisions. "We make them believe, Vera," Alaric replied, his voice steady despite the doubt that crept through him. "We make them believe, or we destroy them." It was a path he had set upon long ago, and there would be no turning back. The Empire would either break, or it would rise, stronger and unyielding. But for the first time, Alaric wondered which of those fates he truly wanted. Alaric stood alone in the darkened command center, the faint hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the walls. The victory on Mars felt distant, like a fleeting dream that had already begun to unravel. His fingers hovered over the controls, eyes scanning the holographic displays that marked the latest reports from the fleet. But the numbers, the data, none of it mattered now. The Empire's foundations were cracking, and no amount of victories could fill the hollow space growing inside him. Behind him, the door slid open, and Lyra entered with a sense of urgency in her movements. "Your Majesty, the situation is deteriorating," she said, her tone clipped. "The rebellion may have been quelled on Mars, but it is spreading elsewhere. It's no longer just a handful of dissidents. Key systems have begun to falter under the strain. There are rumors of organized resistance. Some even claim that there is a faction forming within the Nova Legion itself. Alaric turned to face her, his expression a mask of cold calculation. A faction within the Nova Legion. Lyra nodded, her gaze unwavering. Yes, they're not entirely loyal to you anymore, Emperor. Many of them are questioning the Legion's methods, the sheer scale of the destruction we've caused. Some feel that we have crossed a line, that we've become no better than the enemies we sought to defeat. Alaric's mind raced. The Nova Legion, his ultimate weapon, his creation, was beginning to break apart. They were meant to be the perfect soldiers, unyielding and uncompromising. But the very brutality they had displayed on Mars was now a double-edged sword. His enemies had seen it as the hammer that would crush the rebellion. But those who fought under his banner were seeing it as the first step toward tyranny. "We've crushed the rebellion on Mars," Alaric said, his voice dangerously calm. "But now it's time to eliminate this threat within our own ranks. If they are turning against me, they will be dealt with." Lyra's eyes flashed with concern. "I don't think it's that simple, Emperor. These are not ordinary dissidents. They have deep loyalty to the ideals of the Empire, but they're starting to believe we've strayed too far. They don't want to see the Empire collapse, but they also don't want to see it become something worse." Worse? Alaric's brow furrowed, irritation creeping into his voice. What could be worse than losing everything? "Losing yourself," Lyra said softly. "You've become so focused on securing your reign, on wiping out every opponent, that you've forgotten what this empire was supposed to stand for." Alaric felt a jolt of anger at her words, but he fought it down. She wasn't wrong. He had sacrificed everything in his pursuit of power, his principles, his allies, his very soul. The man who had once dreamed of bringing order and prosperity to the galaxy had become something darker, something more dangerous. And as the unrest spread, Alaric was forced to confront the terrifying truth. His empire was no longer his own. It had become something else entirely, a machine that crushed everything in its path. "I didn't come this far just to fall," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "I will not be the one to let it slip through my fingers." Lyra stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You may not have a choice, Emperor. There's talk of a rebellion from within the Nova Legion, but also from the High Command itself. The generals are growing restless, and Kalen is still out there, playing his cards from the shadows. If he's still alive, he's the one pulling the strings. He's the one who's turning everything against you." Alaric's mind flared with fury at the mention of Kalen's name. The man who had betrayed him, the man who had once been his closest ally. If Kalen was indeed behind this unrest, then the threat was even greater than Alaric had anticipated. "I want him found," Alaric said, his voice cold and deadly. "And when we find him, we will make an example of him. Let the galaxy know that those who dare to defy me will pay the ultimate price." Lyra nodded, but her face remained troubled. "I understand, Emperor, but you need to act fast. The generals are already mobilizing their forces. There's a chance, just a chance, that if you strike now, you can turn the tide before this becomes something you can't control." Alaric's thoughts churned. His empire was on the brink. His authority was being challenged by those who had once pledged their loyalty to him. And Kalen was the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the curtain, waiting for the right moment to ignite the flame of rebellion once again. The weight of the galaxy seemed to press down on him. The Nova Legion, the Empire, the war, all of it rested on his shoulders now. But as the realization set in, a new question burned in his mind. If the Legion turned against him, if the generals rebelled, and Kalen's whispers turned into open revolt, what would he have left? The answer was simple: nothing. Nothing but the ashes of a broken empire and the remnants of a shattered soul. "Prepare the fleet," Alaric said, his voice dark and resolute. "We strike now. No mercy. If Kalen wants war, I will give him war. As Lyra left to execute the orders, Alaric's gaze turned to the window, staring out at the vast emptiness of space. Somewhere out there, Kalen was waiting, preparing. And Alaric knew that his final gambit, this last, desperate play, would determine the fate of everything. But with the Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, Alaric couldn't help but wonder if he had already lost. The final confrontation was coming, and Alaric could feel it in the air, thick with tension and the bitter scent of betrayal. The Imperial fleet, now fully mobilized, hung like a storm over the galaxy. His orders were clear: extinguish the fires of rebellion, eliminate Kalen, and reaffirm his absolute control over the Empire. There would be no compromises. It was all or nothing. The fleet was ready. The Nova Legion was prepared to strike with surgical precision, but Alaric knew this battle would be different. His enemies were not just on the outer rim anymore, and they weren't just in the streets of Mars or hidden away in the shadows of Coruscant. They were everywhere, in his ranks, in his heart, and in the very soul of his empire. The cracks had deepened, and no amount of firepower could fix what was broken. "Emperor, everything is in place." Lyra's voice interrupted his thoughts. She stood at the doorway, her face a study of professional composure. "The fleet is on standby, and we have located Kalen's last known position. We'll launch an assault on his base within the hour." Alaric looked at her, searching her expression for any hint of doubt. None. She was as resolute as ever. But he knew the truth. No one was beyond suspicion now. Not even her. "Do it," Alaric replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But make it quick. We cannot afford delays." Lyra nodded and turned, moving swiftly to implement the plan. But as the door slid shut behind her, Alaric's gaze remained fixed on the holographic display before him, where the map of the galaxy sprawled out like a web of conflict. Every planet, every ship, every ally was a part of this delicate tapestry of power that he had woven. It was all slipping through his fingers. Kalen, the name echoed in his mind like a curse. The man who had once stood by his side, the man who had known his every thought, his every plan. And now he was the Empire's greatest threat. Kalen had known Alaric's weaknesses, perhaps even better than Alaric knew them himself. The rebellion, the unrest, the challenges to his reign. All of it was Kalen's doing, a slow burn of chaos that had been carefully orchestrated from within. But Alaric wasn't a fool. He had seen the signs. Kalen had always been ambitious, always had his own designs on the future. What Alaric had failed to realize until it was too late was that Kalen had never truly shared his vision for the Empire. Kalen saw the Empire not as a tool for order, but as a vehicle for his own power, a means to an end, not an end in itself. And now, Alaric had become the very thing Kalen had always feared, a tyrant, a ruler who would sacrifice anything for control. As the fleet prepared for the assault on Kalen's hidden stronghold, Alaric found himself at a crossroads. He had made his choices, brutal, unforgiving choices that had shattered alliances, betrayed ideals, and forged an empire built on fear. But now, with the weight of it all pressing on him, a question lingered. Was this the future he had wanted? Was this the destiny he had fought for? The answer was simple. No, this was not the empire he had dreamed of. It was a broken reflection of it, a shell of power built on the bones of those he had destroyed. His mind snapped back to the present as the comm link buzzed to life. "Emperor, we are ready to launch the strike on Kalen's position. The fleet is in position. Do you wish to proceed?" Alaric's heart clenched. He had come so far, sacrificed so much. But now, in this final moment, it all felt hollow. He had lost more than a rebellion. He had lost himself. "Yes," Alaric whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of his own soul. "Proceed with the strike. Make it swift." As the Imperial fleet surged forward, leaving behind the cold, endless void of space to engulf Kalen's stronghold, Alaric felt the crushing weight of inevitability. The final gambit had been played. The last card had been dealt. And in that moment, Alaric understood something that had eluded him for so long. Victory was never just about power. It was about what one was willing to sacrifice for it. And now, in the final moments of his reign, he realized that he had sacrificed everything. The future of the Empire was no longer in his hands. The fate of Kalen, the fate of the galaxy, was still to be written.